which are exactly what you see in a geodesic dome. Almost all of the viruses, actually, spherical viruses, have this pattern. The other guy who was working on this was in London. His name was Robert Horn. He also invited Bucky Fuller to visit him. They had long discussions. And like Casper, Horn was also an artist. He's actually still alive and well known for his sea paintings. So there's something about the scientists who are interacting with the artists. In most of these cases, they have a real interest in art. Many of them are themselves amateur artists. And there's another clue for how to make good art-science connections. The artist has to find a scientist who knows enough art to understand how to think like an artist, and vice versa. All right, there's actually another chapter to this Buckminster Fuller story, which is that Harold Kroto got a Nobel Prize for discovering what are called Buckminster fullerenes. Guess why they're called Buckminster fullerenes? Okay, these are compounds that look like a Buckminster Fuller geodesic dome. So basically, Kroto and a couple of his colleagues were working on carbon compounds and had this idea that if you were to make the most stable carbon compound in the world, what would it look like? Well, if Bucky Fuller is correct, and Kroto had actually seen Bucky Fuller's geodesic dome at the 1953 World's Fair, been very excited. In fact, so excited he actually wrote to Bucky Fuller and said, I want to become an architect. Bucky Fuller didn't write back at that point, fortunately for chemistry. But Kroto got excited and said, well, if he's right, then we should be able to make C60 carbon compounds, which look just like a geodesic dome, and they would be more stable than anything else. And not only that, you should see them made in the sun and places like that, which they are. They proved all this. They got a Nobel Prize. Okay, again, knowing Bucky Fuller was important. And again, having this artistic background. These are posters that Kroto made while he was doing his Nobel Prize-winning work. He actually has given interviews, and I've talked to him personally. He was not convinced that he was going to make it as a scientist. So even while he was doing his Nobel Prize-winning chemistry work, he continued to work as a designer and kept that in his back pocket just in case he had to bail out of science and have another career. Pretty strange. All right, another person who's had a big impact on art and science is Ken Snelson. So how many of you know Ken Snelson's tensegrity sculptures? Okay, if you go to the Smithsonian, in the Hirshhorn, there's one of his needle towers. There are lots of, there's one in Grand Rapids. They have one of his other, I forget what it's called, but another one of his tensegrity sculptures there at the Myers Gardens. He's very well known. He's in almost all the major collections. He's still alive. Again, he's another guy that I know personally. He's a wonderful man, by the way. A lot of these people, if you are interested in their ideas, they are more than happy to talk to you. So that's another thing to think about. You may be scared to go in, this guy's famous, what am I going to do? The people who really know what they're doing and really are interested in stuff will talk to virtually anybody who's excited and interested in their stuff. So these are some of his interesting sculptures. The basic principle here is that there are two elements in a tensegrity sculpture. One of them is a rigid rod. So they're often made out of aluminum or steel. And then there's a flexible unit, which are usually some kind of aluminum or steel cable. And the thing that makes the sculpture stable is not because any of the rigid elements touch each other. None of them are allowed to touch each other. Every rigid element is floating in space under the tension of several wires. So the fun part in designing these is you have to see ahead of time how to attach all the wires into all the structural things and then slowly tighten this thing up and it takes on its own form. And people are actually designing these for outer space use because you can take a whole bunch of rods and a whole bunch of cables in them and then just use a winch and take something that's a little flat bundle of stuff and turn it into a great big object like this. All right, so how did he come up with his idea? Well, again, not because he was trying to come up with a basic scientific principle or a new way of thinking about structures in nature, although that's what he came up with. He started out by playing. So the first thing he said was, what if I could combine Bucky Fuller's geodesic dome approach to the world? And he was actually a student of Bucky Fuller's at Black Mountain at the time. And put that together with an Alexander Calder mobile. How's that for a weird thing to try to do? Something that's rigid and stable with something that could move. So he comes up with something that can't exactly move, but that's the thing on the left there. And he ends up calling it tensegrity, structural integrity resulting from tension of flexible elements acting on inflexible ones by compression. This turns out to be patentable. Nobody's thought of this principle before. And you can see, I mean, you can buy these in the stores now. If you've ever seen a squish toy, for example, I mean, these are very, very common objects. One of his patents is on the left there. There's a whole area of tensegrity engineering now for making structures. This is one of the most fantastic ones. I mean, basically, this is a tensegrity sculpture holding up a bridge. I mean, this is really astounding. This is several hundred feet long. There's no structural support under this bridge at all. It's all on top. So this is a new way of thinking about the world. Not only has it impacted the engineering world, it also has given rise to an entirely new form of biology. So these two guys, Don Ingber on the top is at Harvard, Steve Heidemann on the bottom is one of my colleagues at Michigan State University. They're both cell biologists. They're both very interested in arts, particularly sculpture. They both, instead of putting up posters on their walls when they were graduate students, would build themselves little tensegrity models, and that's actually one of them on the bottom there that Steve Heidemann still has, and hang those in their dorm rooms. Okay, so that's how interested they were in these arts. They met at a cell biology conference one day, went to an art museum, started talking about cell biology, art, sculpture. There happened to be a tensegrity sculpture there, and then all of a sudden, lightning struck. What if cells were actually tensegrity sculptures? So it turns out when you look at actin and myosin and all the different filaments inside a cell, they actually, some of them are rigid, some of them are flexible. They have these patterns which really look like some of them are rigid and some of them aren't. And they act like tensegrity sculptures in terms of when you press on them and cut them and so forth and so on. So there's a whole area of tensegrity biology that exists right now, which is very active. So what are the principles again? So Snelson begins, like the other artists, with a purely artistic question. He experiments, like Fuller, to find out what the basic principle is. He ends up getting patents out of this, so it's a totally novel principle, which nobody's seen, even in engineering and places like that. It's interesting because Fuller was so excited by his students' work that he actually stole this. You will see that Fuller claims he invented tensegrity. He clearly didn't, but that's the way Fuller was. It's too bad. And both of Fuller and Snelson did anticipate what would then happen. So this whole idea of art being able to develop principles that anticipate scientific design is quite true. Ken Snelson right now is working on another project which is really kind of interesting. There is a myth in science that you can't imagine or visualize the quantum atom. It's all statistical. It's a haze of probabilities. Ken Snelson says, how do we know that? Maybe that's because the scientists don't have enough visual imagination. So he is trying to work on a way to visualize the quantum atom. I don't know whether he'll ever succeed, but what I do know is he's now developed a whole bunch of new structures that are highly stable that no one has ever seen before, and a whole set of new patents, which somebody's going to find something to do with. It may not be in quantum chemistry, but some scientist who is aware of what his work is going to find another application, which is going to be a lot of fun. All right, kaleidocycles. Artists have actually invented an entirely new geometry. Now, in this case, there's a collaboration. So rather than having an artist do this all on their own and then the scientists pick it up, an artist actually got together with a mathematician in this case to develop the ideas. The designer was Wallace Walker, and the mathematicians Doris Schatzsnyder. They're both still alive and working. The whole thing started out as a Bauhaus exercise. So one of the things that the Bauhaus in Germany used to do is have students take a large sheet of paper, and the exercise was simply to make something interesting out of it. And the rules were very simple. You could fold, you could cut, but you could not paste, glue, or do anything like that. Okay, so what can you do if you can only fold and you can make cuts, but you can't paste, you can't glue, you can't put it back together in any way? So here are some of the things that one of the classes did. Here are some of the faculty exercises. These are pretty amazing if you haven't thought about this as a problem. They're not exactly what you would expect. Well, at Cranbrook, where Wallace Walker was a student, they gave that same exercise. And this is what he ended up inventing. So he took a long sheet of paper. The lines are where he folds it. He then attached the two ends and made this object. This is all one object. This is not three objects. This is the same object which has been pushed through itself. It's like a donut. It has a hole in the center, and I'll show you more about that in a second. He called it isoaxis. It won all sorts of awards. People told him he should patent it, which he did. And then he started trying to figure out, what do I do with it? Is this general? So he asked the question about this general principle because he wasn't really quite sure. He didn't have the imagination to work out all the possibilities. So here's the patent. And somebody told him to talk to Doris Schatzsnyder. The reason they told him to talk to Doris Schatzsnyder, she's a geometer. She had already established a reputation of working with artists. A number of artists, for example, had already shown that one of the myths in geometry is that you can't tile a regular plane with a regular pentagon. And several amateur artists had actually shown that wasn't true. Doris Schatzsnyder had worked with them to publish the papers showing that this myth in geometry was wrong. So she got this reputation of being able to work with people who didn't know a lot of geometry but had a good insight anyway. So she looked at this isoaxis and realized that it might be one example of an entire class of objects. Now, this is the way scientists and mathematicians think. They don't necessarily have the breakthroughs, but as soon as they see something, they want to know how many of them, how many different classes, is it entirely new, et cetera, et cetera. So what she ended up doing was simply making a series of tetrahedrons and saying, how many tetrahedrons can I link together and make something that looks like isoaxis? So here's one that has, I think, 4 tetrahedrons linked together. It turns out that's the smallest one you can make because you make it smaller. The hole is too small to get it to pass through it, so it's not really a kaleidocycle. You can't do anything with it. But you can make bigger and bigger ones. Okay, so there's a whole class of ones that get bigger and bigger. Here's something that somebody is actually selling for dorm rooms. This is really crazy. This is so you can block out the light or hide yourself behind your bed, or block out your roommate so you don't have to know what they're doing or whatever it happens to be. Were there common methods? They've actually addressed this in a number of their interviews. So the mathematical mind, Schatzsnyder says, is quick to ask, what relation does the two-dimensional grid from which isoaxis and the other ones were generated have to the three-dimensional form it produces? Well, this is a question that would never have occurred to Wallace Walker. He's not a geometer. Why would you do that? So she turns out she could not communicate with Walker in the traditional sense of a mathematician. When she asked that question, Walker just sort of stared at her and like, I don't even know what you're asking. What's the meaning of that question? I mean, I take the paper, I fold it, it becomes a three-dimensional object. And she's going, yes, but there are certain transformations that occur in a geometrical way, and we need to work out what the rules are. And he's like, I just do it. I don't understand what you mean by rules. So Schatzsnyder characterized their collaboration as excruciating. He's a fine artist, his work is heavily geometric, but he hasn't the foggiest notion of what he's done mathematically. Okay, so we've avoided all this up to now with all the other examples because the artist and the scientists in general didn't work together. The only ones who, in a sense, really talked to each other was Bucky Fuller, and he was at least a pseudoscientist in the sense that he tried to talk the language. Here's the real joke, and here's where the problem came from. Wallace Walker didn't flunk geometry once in high school. He flunked it 3 times. I mean, if you were to pick the guy most unlikely to come up with a new geometry, it was Wallace Walker. All right, so one of the things we have to come to grips with here is that the way artists think about problems is not the same way that scientists do, and the way we select for scientists may in fact be getting rid of the most creative scientists, okay? Because they're going to think more like an artist. And that's one of the points of me writing the kinds of things I write about. So how do you capture it? And the collaboration is one of the ways to do it. They've gone on to actually collaborate on doing some really interesting things. Schatzsnyder was very interested in Escher, analyzed how he came up with all his patterns and his tilings, and then eventually showed that you could, every one of the different kaleidocycles, it has a different kind of tiling that's associated with it. These are very popular. You can buy the books and now you can make your kaleidocycles. They have Escher designs on them. This sells wildly all over the world. And it's very important for the scientists. Not only is there a new geometry, Schatzsnyder actually realized from working with Wallace that if she was going to teach geometry to people who weren't just naturally good at geometry, she needed to start talking to them in a new way. So working with Swarthmore College, they have invented an entirely new curriculum for those people who are like Wallace, very visual, very geometrically intuitive, but really don't understand all this, here's the proof kind of stuff, which drives a lot of us nuts. All right, so again, artists, scientists speak different professional languages. They have different goals quite often. So collaborations become ongoing negotiations. And if you're going to be working next semester with some of the scientists, you should be expecting this. Both sets of participants have to be flexible because they're, you got to work out how the language is going to work and why you can't do this, but you want to do it anyway. A true collaboration is one where you need both the partners to actually make everything work, and a true collaboration is going to change how both work. All right, one last example. If I have time, I'll show you a little of my work, but otherwise I'll end with this one. Photosynthetic photography. This is another collaboration. Here we have actually 2 couples. One with a couple who works together in their art, and one is a couple who works together in their science, collaborating. And this is an ongoing collaboration, actually. Heather Ackroyd and Dan Harvey are British artists, very interested in environmental types of art. So here's their ice lens. They actually took just a bunch of ice, packed it together, and then turned it into a lens, which they photographed. As the sun's setting here, the whole object of most of their art is that it is going to disappear. So it's not something they can hang in a gallery and that you're going to be able to buy and take to your home. It's about process and change. They really got together and started working in earnest as a couple when they began thinking about how to transform interior spaces into exterior spaces. So here they figured out how to take sod and cover the walls of an abandoned church in a very bad neighborhood in London, so that inside it's all green and beautiful, and you walk outside and it's an absolute, disaster. There's trash everywhere and it's gray and it's awful. By chance, they ended up with an insight. So while they were doing these installations, they happened to leave a ladder leaning against the wall. Now, if you think about this, every day the sunlight comes in, so there's going to be a shadow produced on the wall. And after a while, what happens when you have a shadow? and you have grass. Anybody ever left their, right, a ladder or a chair or your hose or whatever it is on the grass, and then you pull it away, and what do you have? Green grass around, a bunch of yellow stuff, right? So they had this brilliant idea that they could make photographs photosynthetically on grass. The problem is that it disappears within 24 hours. Okay, you put the light back on it, it disappears. You put it inside, the grass dies. So how do you, as an artist, exhibit this kind of artwork? So that became their problem. They had this brilliant idea. They were convinced there was something really interesting. It fits with their overall idea of transient images, using nature, bringing the outside in, and so forth and so on. But they can't make it work. They can make it work just far enough that they know what the problem is, but not far enough to actually make it work as art. One day they are reading, this is what every artist reads, I'm sure, right? How many of you are artists? And you all read New Scientist, right? Okay, so they're reading New Scientist. This already shows they have a much wider interest than the average artist. And there's an article about Ugam and Thomas in something called Stay Green Grass. So what's Stay Green Grass, and who are these people? So Helen Ugam is a woman, molecular biologist, working on how grass grows and all the molecular biology and how chlorophyll and photosynthesis work and that kind of stuff. You can see her holding there a silver cup. She is also one of the world's champions in solving crossword puzzles. So she has a second career where all the major crossword puzzle makers send her the crosswords, and if it takes her more than something like 90 seconds, then it's a good crossword and they can use it because she is so fast. She just boom, boom, boom. Okay. So she's also a fantastic computer programmer because the same kind of thinking goes into seeing all the patterns between a set of operations and so forth. She works with her husband, Sid Thomas, who's a more classical molecular biologist, again studying photosynthesis and that kind of stuff. But he does the hands-on manipulation of things in the lab with the actual grass and all that kind of stuff and does the analysis. All right, so over the years, they discovered simply by chance, taking many, many samples of grasses from many different places, on the lower left there, that there was a type of fescue, which is probably the kind of grass that you're actually growing in your lawns if you have a lawn, which for some reason would stay green for weeks and weeks, even without water or without sunlight, and found that there was a genetic mutation in it, which led them to understand much more deeply how photosynthesis worked. This is extremely practical in some ways because it turns out that if grass stays green, it has a much higher protein content. So this is literally worth billions to the agriculture people, which meant they were willing to put lots of money into their institute to study how you could get this kind of genetic mutation in all kinds of feed for animals, because the more green it is, you have green hay during the winter, there's much more protein, the animals are better fed through the winter, and so forth and so on. Right, so they have a wonderful institute. And basically what happened was that Harvey and Ackroyd wrote to them and said, we have this problem. How can we make a long-lasting image? Ugam and Thomas said, wow, what a cool question. And because it was a well-designed question and it was clear that they had the right kinds of techniques, they immediately began looking for a way to collaborate. So it turns out that the UK is different than the US. Here we probably couldn't even do this. But in the UK there are two places you can go to for art science types of funding. One's the Wellcome Trust, which mainly does biomedical, but the other is Nesta, National Endowment for Science, Technology, and the Arts. They actually applied to both as a team. And the whole object here, when they applied, and you don't have to read this whole thing, but if you actually, this is the actual abstract for the Nesta grant that they wrote. And basically every other line is, this is what we're going to do as a scientist, this is what we're going to do as an artist. This is how it's going to benefit the science, this is how it's going to benefit the art. It goes back and forth, so it's very clear to anybody who's trying to evaluate this that both sets of people are required to do the research, and both sets of people are going to benefit from it. Now we're starting to move towards this in the US. The National Science Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities have actually signed an agreement that they will start making this kind of funding available in the next year or two. So if you're interested in going in this direction, money is going to start coming. NSF has already started putting some of it out on its own. But fortunately, this was available 10 years ago for Ackroyd and Harvey. Ugam and Thomas gave them the technology. They showed them how to use the appropriate kinds of strains of grass. They could then make their images, and they would last for weeks. So now they could put things up indoors and outdoors and have people come and watch the exhibits. It also changed the way the scientists work, because one of the things that needed to be done was for all these images to be archived. And Helen Ugam had all the computer technology and the scanning materials and so forth, equipment to take the photographs, scan them in, and in trying to understand how best to get the highest quality digital images, she began to realize that it would be possible to start analyzing all of the plant material in the same way. So they got a hold of very special infrared and ultraviolet cameras that are used for outer space work on satellites, and started digitally imaging all of these grass images as well as their actual plant materials, and found, and there's a classic paper they wrote, that they could do away with all the standard biochemical and genetic analysis that they had to do previously, which would take them years, run these things through these scanners, get the same data in literally a matter of minutes. And they now have it, part of their institute is a multi-million-dollar imaging facility where they can screen literally millions of plant specimens a year to find out which ones have these stay green types of materials. So I actually asked them, why did the collaboration work? What would you do if you're going to try and do this again? And basically, Thomas said that the cultural barrier was unusually low because he had been he's very withdrawn, he doesn't talk very much, had been a quite serious jazz musician. Well, it turns out when you go to England, he may be an amateur, but all the professionals know who he is. So very serious, I think, would be the right word here. He recognized the way they were going through a structured exploration as artists, sort of trying things. They had a good question that was very clear. And so for him, it was a common wellspring. He understood what they were doing, and they knew what they wanted. They knew why they were coming to the scientists with a very clear question, so they knew that everybody would benefit. So I guess that used up my time, right? I don't want to go over here, but... Okay, well, I can rush through this, and that'll leave us 10 minutes. So 5 more minutes then. All right, so some of my arts and collaborations. I actually practice what I study, as Leah said earlier. I actually do art, and I collaborate with a transmedia artist named Adam W. Brown. You can see some of his work at http, / whatever it is, adamwbrown.net. Adam W. Brown being all one word. I don't think you can understand what the critical questions are or how to go about implementing art-science interactions unless you actually try it. I don't know that I'm really good. It doesn't really matter. The point is, by trying, you find out what works. You know what kinds of questions to ask. You know where the pitfalls are, and so forth. So one of the points I want to make here, and it's one that I think is sort of hidden in all the previous examples, is that understanding and knowing are different. Okay, a lot of people, both in sciences and arts, have written about understanding being the ability to take what you know and use it. Okay, so it's the sort of knowledge that Wallace Walker had. He may not have been able to formally tell you the principles, but he could do it. Knowing can be very passive. And there's a wonderful example from a colleague of mine who studies why some students don't do well in school. And basically what she did was she set up an exercise for kids in a very poor neighborhood of Boston where they were to make mobiles. And of course, when you make a mobile, there's also a scientific principle. You have to balance all the weights on a fulcrum. Each one of the places where you are hanging something is a fulcrum, and all the weight on either side of that fulcrum has to balance for every single one of the little places that you're hanging something. Okay, so they'd watch kids build, they would watch the teachers teach. What it turned out was there were people who could build beautiful sculptures. They worked. There were people who could explain the principle. These were two different sets of people. The people who could build the mobiles very rarely could explain the principle other than saying, well, it's like a teeter-totter, it has to balance. But they couldn't write out the basic, and it's a very simple equation for how you actually do the balancing. The people who could write the equation to do the balancing could almost never build the mobile, and this was true of the teachers as well. And then there was this very small group in the center who could do both. Well, those are the ones who actually understand, because they can do it and tell you how it works and what the principle is. All the people we've been talking about are in that middle category, with very few exceptions. So that's sort of what you are aiming for and what science and art can do for you. So it turns out that my introduction to biology was actually through art. I don't know if any of you know who Charlie Harper is. He was one of the most famous illustrators of the 1950s and 60s. He recently died. His heirs have brought out all sorts of stuff. He's becoming very popular. So if you walk into a lot of bookstores, or his books and models and all sorts of stuff are out there. But just to give you an example of how beautifully he did, these are Darwin's finches. He has essentially abstracted out all the information that's essential to understanding the finches and how they evolved, and gotten rid of all the nonsense that you don't need to know about. Okay? They're really beautiful illustrations. He does this with everything. And I remember being completely enamored of these images, and they're still with me. I mean, I can still see pages out of this book 50 years later. I mean, it's astounding. Incredibly impressive stuff. I didn't realize as a kid what was going on, but here's Mitchell Feigenbaum, who invented the mathematics of chaos theory, and he actually goes to art museums to study how artists do things, because he said it's abundantly obvious that one doesn't know the world around us in detail. What artists have accomplished is realizing that there's only a small amount of stuff that's important, and then seeing what it was so they can do some of the research for me. That's what Harper was doing. He was taking all the verbiage and all the details and finding the essence. So eventually I realized that. I ended up doing my undergraduate work with a guy named Bob Langridge at Princeton University, the first person ever to make a mathematical model of DNA, which then ended up turning into these beautiful images. And he actually got the cover of Science with this pair of images. One was the rose window from a cathedral. One is a molecular model of DNA looking down its length. And